That's the life of a fisherman you wouldn't understand. Something you can't feel on dry land. You gotta get your arms way up in a cage and set the hook on smallmouth bass, and then you'll understand. You gotta get your hands on a Shimano reel and a G-Loomis rod. I bet you like what you feel. Step on the deck, give it a whirl. Hello, welcome to my world.
What's going on, all you Facebook Live and YouTube Live fishing freaks? Got a good one for you this evening. Got Jason Kenner, who has been a part of the spearhead of, especially in the local area, of trying to get F1s introduced into the local waters in Kentucky, which, you know, I'm from Ohio, JR's from Kentucky, but it seems like I fish Kentucky waters way more than I do any Ohio waters. But we're going to talk about F1s and what it's taken to get here, and what kind of information he's got, and just kind of give the whole rundown about Florida stream bass. And if you guys don't care to give this thing a share, I'd appreciate it. So without further ado, let's bring on Mr. Kenner. What's up, Jason? How we doing today, buddy?
What's up, guys? How are y'all?
Not too bad. Larry Slack in the house.
I hit it. You showed it.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like they'd be like, "Hey, JR, play that clip about Liver King," like Jamie on Joe Rogan podcast. Which, by the way, so anyway, guys, thanks for joining this episode of On Another Line Live. Tonight we are joined by the man, the myth, the legend, owner, Mr. Jason Kenner himself, who I've mentioned his group on here a lot, Anglers for Improving Opportunities on Facebook. If you are not a member of that group, and this is not just for Kentucky, Ohio, this is like, this is for everybody. It's just everybody's trying to get together and try to make a better habitat and a better, more, awesome experience fishing. And
Yes,
it takes a lot of stuff to go on. I'm sure Jason, when he started this deal, he thought that it was probably going to be really tough to make a difference, but, I'll let Jason talk about it in just a minute. But like, through him and his folks that he knows in like the legislature and people that he's talked to and people that have got behind him, and not just him, but all across the state, we're now getting ready to introduce at some point in the next year and a half, some Florida stream bass into Kentucky waters that are local to us, and Paintsville being one of those. So Jason, if you don't care, you can just kind of give us an overview of what that bill was, and then we'll kind of go on from there.
So it's been a long process. The state organizations, they don't move fast, in this regard in any way. Unfortunately, and as anglers, we want things to happen, tonight, tomorrow, next week. And, so it's not that way at all. It's been about 3 years. We started, 3 years ago. Our county judge, kind of put together a meeting with Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife in Kentucky, our state fisheries biologist. We start asking questions. The first thing I think that most everybody wants to do is throw genetics, at anything, whether that be pure Floridas or even F1s. And I think you can make an argument for either in a lot of cases, especially in private impoundments in Kentucky, based on, some of the data that you could definitely grow a bigger fish when Florida genetics are involved. In 2020, I guess when we started, there was no DNA on statewide in Kentucky. There'd been 2 limited, I think in 91, and then 2004, 2005. There were 2 limited DNA samples gathered on, multiple lakes in Kentucky, but nothing like what was done, in 2023. So, without understanding, what was there, how could we know, what grew our biggest bass? And it turned out, when our state record was caught in 2019. It was caught from High Splint Lake, which is a glorified pond. Let's be honest, it's 2 or 3 acres. It's nothing big. There are rumors that it was stocked, with pure Florida fish at some point in time. And, then in 2019, it grew a 14-pound, 9.5-ounce largemouth bass. So then you come to find out that fish was 60% Florida and that population was 60% Florida. So, it just led us to asking a bunch of questions. The first thing that our state, and I think most states will tell you, is, habitat number one, we've got aging lakes. You don't hear about lakes, popping up every day. Most of our lakes are 40, 50 years old, and a lot of that timber's, died out, rotted away. So we've done, a lot of significant things there. Our nonprofit, we formed a 501(c)(3). So that allowed us to apply for grants, and find different funding that was available. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, it's amazing how much funding's out there. We turned down $5,000 this year, for Yatesville Lake because we're not organized, I guess, enough there yet, to be able to do those things like we are at Paintsville, but hopefully we can get there. But nonetheless, there's a ton of opportunities out there, for money. Bass Pro Shops Foundation was who, that we turned down there. You probably saw the Reef Ball project recently on Paintsville Lake. So there's a bunch of cool stuff, and there's some research there. We've used corrugated pipe, we used some plastic as opposed to, Christmas trees and, things that don't last, 4 or 5 years, as opposed to plastic can be there forever. And then we've stocked 150,000 threadfin shad in the last 3 years, 50,000 a year. So that's about, 45 grand worth of shad that's been put in our lake. So a lot of cool things going on there. Our quest, as you know, is can we grow a double-digit bass? So I guess we get to see at this point, right?
Yeah, and that's awesome. And like if we kind of step back there, you're talking about the state record at caught at High Splint, and I've been doing some research on that. And High Splint's is the one that just has like the one single dock, right? And it's like a kidney bean shape. Like
I went to Fish Pond. I couldn't put my boat in High Splint. Obviously, it's too small. But yes, it's like a kidney bean shape. It's small. It does get the highest density trout stocking in the state. And our state correlates the state record to the trout as opposed to the genetics. Of course, you followed us long enough. Put a pure northern in there. Will it grow to 14 pounds, 9.5 ounces with all this trout? They say no. Right? So
here's what I can definitely tell you is that if we look at Vesuvius, which is kind of like, it's actually a fairly large lake for what it is. For locally, it's not like Grayson or Yatesville or close to Paintsville size, but it's way bigger than High Splint, and they dump a crap ton of rainbow and brown trout in that thing in the springtime every year. It always gets stocked. And there are some large fish in there, but the biggest one I've ever seen come out of there. So they drained the lake, I don't know, I'm guessing 20 years ago now, probably. They had some dam issues. They drained the lake to where it was just a babbling brook through it. It was just a creek running through it. And then like all the fish was in there practically died. And then they rebuilt the dam, and then they reintroduced bass and stuff to it. But the biggest bass that I know of that's ever come out of there, and these are stocked with pure northern strain bass, is like 7 pounds, 7.5 pounds. So it doesn't have the threadfin that you guys are putting in there, but it does have the trout. But one thing that I think that most politicians and people that have the ability to kind of pull the trigger and make this happen with public funding and stuff is that you see all these DNR records and reports saying that F1s will not live in certain areas of the world. Now, if you look at High Splint, in my opinion, I think that it negates a lot of their negativity because they always say that they have to have a ton of water to roam. They have to have water flowing through it. They have to have stuff that, stays temperate climate. And let's face it, a 3-acre pond is going to be freaking frozen across it every year. And it's just going to have what forages in there other than the trout.
I agree.
So I think that kind of, if they look at that kind of puts the momentum in our side a little bit. We're like, look, this ain't got to be Chickamauga where it's 100 foot deep and it's got a river flowing through it, because at High Splint, if even at 60%, that means that somebody somewhere there had to be a 100% Florida strain bass in that lake somewhere. You know what I mean? It had to get there somehow.
And if you look at Paintsville, let's say every time they redo the data, it gets a little closer to 100. But so let's call it 96, 4, whatever. It still doesn't meet the criteria to be a pure northern population, in Texas or Florida. But, so if it's 96.4 and you go and stock 5 years of, 50%, Florida bass, and if you were to get to a point that you had, sorry, my phone went off. If you were to get to a point that you had even 20 or 30% Florida genetics, I think you'd have to consider it a success. You know, if you go back to 2000 when they started on Chick, you know, by 2005 they'd started with fingerlings, and by 2005 they hadn't even moved it to where we are now. You know, with that percentage of Florida genetics in the population. Then they stocked larger fish, and the outcome changed. So, you know, that was kind of where our premise came from. You know, hey, let's go with even, and we're trying to cheat the curve. You know, JR knows way more about the biology as related to any of us, you know, anglers and whatnot here. But you know what I mean? We're trying to take a larger fish. A 4 to 8 inch fish is a 2 to 3 year old fish. You know, it takes 3 years to have a 12-inch bass in Kentucky. So if you could take a 4 to 8 inch fish and you could grow, let's say, a 6 or 7 pound bass in a set amount of time, you know, what's the cost versus the return on investment there? You guys know if there's the opportunity to catch a 10-pound bass, there's no limits. I mean, you drove, Tyler, you know, you drove all the way to Texas for the prospect of, you know, one of those 10-pound bass. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I mean,
I think the return on investment's crazy. You know, if we just
yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna like the trip. So we were gone 13 days, or no, we were gone 11 days, and I'm gonna say on the low end, we spent $3,500.
right,
And you know, we camped most of the time, and that $3,500 went and was pumping into somebody else's economy. Like we were pumping it away from our economy, and you know, that's one thing that I really enjoy from your guys' group, is the fact that you know you're really harping on not this just doesn't affect anglers, and that's true. You know, like for example, some really cool news that's kind of local to me here, the Cold Grove boat ramp, which you know obviously is on the High River, but at the Ashland boat dock when they built that thing, they were like they had one of the nicest boat docks on the planet. You could put like 10 boats in at the same time. You could park like 200 trailers over there, and then they made it the port of Ashland and made it. From what I understand, talking to people that are in the know, that they just basically forgot to put a boat ramp even in the place. You know, so they actually had to like dredge out an area to put a 1 lane boat ramp in there, and they made the boat parking all the way on top of the hill. But the reason I was talking about Cold Grove is that we now they just got like $1.2 million, the village of Cold Grove did, to redo all of that down there. They're going to be paving out all from the railroad tracks all the way over to the boat ramp. Going to be taking all those mounds of dirt that are just taking up parking spots, flattening all those up, and repaving the whole thing, putting new lights down there. Camera system is going to be the whole nine. But
that's awesome.
the way that they were looking at that, you know, I was part of the quote unquote steering committee with that money, and they just wanted people in the area that use the boat dock a lot to kind of, you know, talk about how they should spend the money. And the reason that, you know, that I was down there, you know, for it, and we were talking about it, I was like, you know, if you look at the amount of tournaments that are had in our area, like Yatesville, Paintsville is now coming on because you guys got a great thing going on down there. But like from Thursday until Sunday, every week from March until October, November, there's 2 to 3 tournaments on Yatesville a week, and sometimes a day. And you know, and it doesn't really, you know, there's one gas station there by Yatesville, but that's what I was talking to my mayor when we were doing this. Like, you know, we have these bass tournaments down there, or people that come from miles around to use the ramp to have their club tournament there. You know, we have Speedway right there off the exit. People, that, you know, it's easy to get your boat in there, and they're swinging there buying $150 worth of fuel every time they go to the boat ramp. So,
Every
you know,
time.
it injects, you know, money into the economy in your local area. You know what I mean? So it's like, instead of me going to spend $3,500 to go to Texas to try to catch a 10-pound bass, we now could potentially corral those people from, you know, 3 or 4 states over, just like I did, to come to Paintsville, to Yatesville. You know, it could be the Lake Fork of the, you know, the northeastern area. Who knows?
So that's my question. You went to Lake Fork. I mean, you know, we've got all this standing timber. You know, obviously the standing timbers has a bit to do with Lake Fork's success. I mean, could you see us as like a mini Lake Fork? I mean, can we dream of that? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't see why not. You know, I think that the reason that Lake Fork is so special is the fact that the state of Texas bought in wholesale. You know, they wanted to, you know, the research that I'd done about the place, and I talked to several people, the Texas Parks and Wildlife, while I was there. You know, their idea was is that they wanted to grow the United States record, the country record at that lake. So that's where that Share Lunker program came from. That's where a lot of the Kentucky DNR, the Texas DNR stuff. They have a giant like a hub there, not too far from it, and they wholesale went in just for the fact that they wanted to grow, a world record size fish. Now, I think the biggest one they've caught out there's been like 16 or 17 pounds, which is an absolute absurd bass. But
Yeah.
can they get there? I think so. But back to your question, I think that absolutely can, especially with folks like you and JR and I when we can, spreading the word of not only doing what you can for conservation as far as catch and release big bass and stuff, but I think now we're all seeing it, including yourself, is the other end of that. If we look at Grayson now has a population of like 10 million bass, it seems like, but they're anywhere from 5 inches to 12 inches. So like
Yes, sir.
now we have as anglers, we have this moral or this obligation now, if we want to really do something big, and this is not just in Grayson, this is Paintsville, this is Yatesville, this is other places you fish. Like the reason that the limit is there for a reason, and I'll be absolutely 100% honest with you. Up until this past year, I was totally against it. I didn't see a
Agree, me
reason
too.
for it. Like I would go out and catch 100 bass a day and I would release them all. And since then, since this year comes up and Grayson has that slot limit now, I've taken more largemouth bass out of fisheries this year than I have in the last 20 years combined.
Me too. Agree with that.
And I think it becomes now, it's good to share the word like we're doing now to get people's idea up that not only one is there potential to have Florida strain bass in areas that are close to us, but in order to make that a successful endeavor, we have to do our part to ensure that we're harvesting those smaller bass. And like looking at, I mean, even a 4 or 5 pound bass, if you look at that thing and it's skinny and it looks like it's not going to live, take that thing out of there. And
Agree.
that's something I would have never done. Like I'm like, oh, he looks bad, but he's going back. You know what I mean?
I definitely think that we have all of the things, the key elements as far as places for the bass to live. I think we've got the bait. I think there is no reason why, other than funding, that we cannot be, an area with multiple lakes that can be that, tourist attraction for bass fishermen across the United States. There's no reason, we have the bait. I mean, gosh, look at Yatesville and look at the bait in that place. It's unreal. I mean, I think like you guys have, Jason, putting those, thread fin in, it seems like that has gotten, quite a bit of, movement in that lake. So, starting there and moving to F1s, I think was the right way to do it. I think that, if you're putting in a bigger predator, you've got to think about, well, it has to have the forage for that. And I mean, to me, fishing Yatesville for as many years as all of us have, I think it'd be an obvious choice. I mean, Paintsville Lake, I think that being where you guys are at, I fished it twice now, and I was very pleasantly surprised the second time around. So I'm excited to, where this is going to grow. But, we have to have the support, unfortunately, from the government.
That's the crazy thing, JR, is you never dream getting into this. You think it's going to be science based. It has zero to do with science. You know about that. It's all politics. I mean, it is all politics, unfortunately. Does that mean it's right? Does that mean it's wrong? You know what I mean? But that's just the game that you have to play to get things done. I agree. I think if you look at growth rates on Paintsville Lake, and if F1's working, Paintsville Lake has slower growth rates. Most of our Eastern Kentucky lakes do. So if F1s do work in Paintsville Lake, I think you can make an argument, broadly across the board. Hey, they're going to work in, especially Yatesville, because I'm like you. When forward-facing sonar came about, and you go through Paintsville, I texted our local biologist, Jason Russell. Got a great relationship with the guy. He's excellent. You know, I was like, hey, you know, when I go to Paintsville versus Yatesville, I see 10 times the life on active target 2 that I see in Yatesville over Paintsville. You know, why is that? You know, I do think the Threadfin have changed things. You know, it looks better on Paintsville compared to Yatesville, but I'm with you. If these things will go anywhere in Eastern Kentucky, if you put F1s in Yatesville, they'll go.
Mhm. And you've
Yeah,
got to
and
think too about the forage can kind of, like for lack of a better term, smoke out the ability of the bass. So the classic uh, example would be crappie. Crappie are animals that reproduce quickly, and they are taking a lot of the forage out. So you know the more crappie you have, like I'm definitely not putting crappie in my F1 pond there, Jared, because they take up a lot of the forage for bass. So
Agree.
that's another aspect of it that is kind of is certainly a lot more complicated than we make it. And thankfully, there's a lot of biologists, like you said, Jason, to kind of give us the lead on that. But thankfully, it seems like we're getting a little bit of motion in the right direction of this. Um, we're no longer just saying, "Oh, we're trying to maintain northern genetics," when that is a farce. There is no northern genetics. A bass is
Agree
a
with you.
bass, and they're all intermingled. So it's something that, if we're going to really look into um, making our fisheries something that people travel for and inject money into our economy, and that is the language that these politicians speak.
Agree.
That is the angle. I mean, I went up to St. Clair and I met at least, like, people not going for the tournament, um, two or three different boats that were from Ashland. Like,
That's
why
crazy.
can't we have people traveling to here to fish our trophy bass lake? There's no reason.
yeah, so I
This,
think that's going to happen. It takes some time, and and to kind of speak to your point about the crappie, there is that crappie, bluegill, all these other I caught one of the biggest hybrid uh, bass I'd ever caught in my entire life the other day at Grayson Lake. Like I knew there were some in there, but I didn't know that they were like that big in there. Like this thing weighed like 10 pounds. It was a giant. It was like
that's awesome.
25 inches. It was like 25 inches long. Yeah, and I think it comes down to the fact that not only just bass, but like people like you can go to Grayson and Yatesville right now with forward facing sonar, which has absolutely changed the crappie fishing game for sure. You can go and catch 1,000 crappie, but they'll be like this long. You know what
Agree.
I mean? Like, and
That's my
like,
experience.
it's very frustrating to, even if we're bass anglers, and we go out there and we catch every bass and keep every bass we have, is it really doing anything if we can't get these other folks that are catching crappie or whatever to keep them as well? If I'm out catching fish now, normally I wouldn't do that, but if I'm catching small bass, then if I'm catching crappie, they go on my live well too.
So have you guys seen the debate, you know, on our page? We talked about, you know, in Kentucky, you guys know, you brand something, it doesn't go, it kind of gets a bad reputation. If you look at the slot, you know, in Kentucky, tournament anglers hate the slot. Now you got to remember on tell me if I'm wrong, but on the bass harvest side, there's less than 5% of bass that get harvested. So, you know, when you're talking about a regulation, it's a guideline. It's not like people are actually harvesting, you know, bass like we talk about. We wish that they would, but you know, it seems like the 10-inch minimum, you know, in Kentucky, 12-inch minimum, 6 fish creel is statewide regulations. So a lot of our guys have argued, we've run up a couple polls, that a 10-inch minimum, because, you know, they say the bottleneck in that population happens between 9 and 13 inches. And, you know, a lot of guys say, well, if you have a slot, you know, who's going to fillet a 6-inch bass? You know, I tend to agree with that, right? You know, what's there? But so if you went with a 10-inch minimum, and even if you threw in Kentucky, they don't want any regulations to be too complicated. If you threw a 1/20 inch, uh, with the exception of a live release tournament, you know, an aerated live well, is that too complicated? versus a slot limit? I don't know. Just a question I have for you guys.
I mean, I think you're gonna. I think one thing that brings bass fishermen kind of get a bad rap is because of tournament fishing anyway. But like,
Agree.
I think as a tournament angler, and I'm not just a tournament angler, like I fish 3 days a week normally, and I'm fishing my tournament maybe one of those days. But like
Yes, sir.
the biggest thing about me keeping fish of any kind of size, if I'm at a tournament, is that I go out and I rack my brain and I rack my body for 8 to 10 hours a day, and I definitely do not want to come home and start filleting fish before I put my boat up and all the other jazz. So,
Yes,
you know,
sir.
somebody like JR has a little bit, now that he has this pond, makes it easier for me to do that, right? I just pull my boat up there to his house, unload my fish, and go home, as opposed to that takes 30 seconds as opposed to dragging out the fillet knife and getting the fillet table out and then cleaning all the fish and then putting them in bags to put them in the freezer or giving them to somebody. It
Right.
takes a lot of effort to be mindful about harvesting bass, because it's just like killing a deer, man. I haven't killed a deer in 10 years probably. I love venison. It's an awesome meat. I would eat it today if I could. But when you kill a deer, that's when the freaking work starts.
I feel that. I feel that.
So I think that a lot of people like to do are that same way. But and I heard somebody say something the other day that kind of like resonated with me, is like, what what is a detriment to taking bass out of places like that? Like, for example, Grayson, right across the dam at Grayson, there's a pretty good sized river running through there. It's a creek, but it's
Yes,
a
sir.
pretty good sized deal. Like, it's like 10 foot deep. That's saying pretty much for a long ways. I know that those things dry up and stuff, but what's the harm of just putting those past the dam in those things? You know what I mean?
Because some inevitably have to slip through the dam anyway, right? I mean,
Right.
they have to.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
So,
I agree.
I like the
pushing them.
thought of being able to do that, Jason. Not the other aspect of it that I think of is I think we have too many tournaments on smaller lakes. To me, I wish that we could have more coordination, and maybe if we had somebody that was monitoring those releases, we could also register for these tournaments. Let's say, okay, on July 1st, we're only going to have one tournament, and I know
Yes, sir.
that's something, of course, the DNR does not want to do because it's a lot of work. But if they're
Right.
really invested in it, that's a way to do it.
Oh, we got Ale in the background. What's up, Ale? So I know I can't speak for Kentucky, but I know most lakes, especially Corps of Engineer lakes like Paint Creek and Rocky Fork and places like that, you have to get a permit to hold a tournament. Is that the same? I don't think it's the same way with Kentucky, is it?
No, Kentucky's kind of wide open, but at the same time, I think in the summertime you should be looking at 3 fish tournaments instead of 5 fish tournaments. Once the water gets up to a certain level, 80 degrees, that the water can store less dissolved oxygen. So I think that the common sense thing, especially if you want to grow big fish, because you guys know, if you're talking about a fish that's going to get 13, 14, 15 years old, that fish has probably been handled a few times, and it's going to have to be handled with care, to beat the odds and make it to that size. So, it's definitely something we're going to have to be conscious of.
Yeah, and that's something I've been really diving into, trying to get my head wrapped around, is the delayed morbidity aspect
Yes,
of
sir.
things. Like, I don't know the exact number of it. That there's people out there that are really that are drinking the Kool-Aid that'll tell you that 80% of the fish that are caught on a tournament dies, a day later, which I think that's BS, because I know for a fact, I can prove this with pictures. JR and I were at Yatesville. Now, this is kind of like, doesn't really go along with that statistic because we didn't put it in the live well, but JR caught a 3.5 pound fish on one bank. Took a picture of it. We went back out the next week, same bank. He caught the exact same fish there. And I could tell by it was by there's a big giant black spot in like this really weird formation that was on the same side of the fish. Like I could show you side by side the picture, and you'd be like, "Yep, that's the same bass." Now, I do think that, like you said, we get. I mean, right now when I had my pleasure boat out at Yatesville on Sunday, and the water temperature was 84 degrees. Now, if you're not putting ice in your live well, not putting G juice in there, and people have, I have 20-year-old live wells in my boat, but that's one of the things I keep up the most with, as I replace my bilge pumps in my live wells once every 2 or 3 years, just because I don't want the fact that, I killed the very first bass this year of my life in a tournament by myself, and it was just a weird deal. I set the hook, hooked it in the tongue, and then I thought it was going to be okay, and it just died in the live well. And like, that's the stuff that I try to get away from. But the delayed morbidity thing is a hard thing too. And it wasn't here. I was fishing a Toyota Series last year at let's see, it was St. Lawrence River. It's like the end all be all for smallmouth, and went there and fished for 3 days or 2 days. The tournament was 3 days, and the very first day that we came back, they had those big giant green igloo coolers, like 100-gallon, 100 whatever they are, big like 108-gallon giant things. Man, I think I could lay down in them, and they had 5 or 6 of those things. I mean, stacked so full of dead smallmouth that were 3 to 7 pounds. It was unreal. Like when I say, I've never seen that many dead fish in my entire life. And, it comes down to the fact of people not understanding how to fizz bass, or fizzing them incorrectly, or, bringing them out of deep water, throwing them in the live well, and they, in a sense, it's basically drowned because they can't filter water through their gills. It's just so crazy that I see that. But, when you look at our area here, does that affect the amount of bass that we see in our lakes? I think it does. And I think it goes back to the fact that what Jared was just alluding to is that, it's kind of wide open for regulations as far as whoever can have a tournament there that they want to. And, as we mentioned before, and I think you guys are going to have to deal with that at Paintsville a lot too, now that you guys are getting some hammer style fish in there, that there's 3 to 5 tournaments a week for, I'm guessing, 40 weeks at Yatesville.
Yeah, and
there's got to be some stop sign on it, I think, and it's to me, what is the negative if you are saying, okay, instead of having one club tournament, maybe we say, okay, we're going to have this club fish together, and even in that aspect, I think it would help. It's a little bit complicated. I do think that our morbidity in our lake probably is not as bad as some of those northern lakes. As much as I love smallmouth, I do think they're more prone to
agree with that.
Having issues as far as delayed morbidity and frankly mortality, dying. They're just a little bit more delicate than a largemouth as far as they're often deeper, they are more prone to barotrauma, they're just not as robust in that sense. But it's I don't know, I feel like the DNR should really be a bass fisherman's best friend and vice versa. It's just that relationship has never been established, and I've never understood why. And it's
I agree with that.
It's just going to have to take somebody to, to me, we should be the people that are out there advocating for our lakes and advocating for, I mean, obviously not just the lakes, but the woods, things like that. And we are going to be the conservationists of, our lakes and our woods. So there's no reason for the DNR not to make the fisherman their best friend in taking care and making, the wildlife better.
I totally agree. And, one of the things that you have to talk about there, in relation to these tournaments is I think you guys saw Zach Slagle, the biologist he did the study on movement of smallmouth bass, in Lake Erie. And the thing that I always heard, you guys know you fish up north. I've been going to Lake Erie for 25 years. There's days that you can catch them, there's days you can't, just like everywhere else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a guy always told me, he said, smallmouth always had their bags packed, meaning they move a lot.
Yeah.
Zach did that study, and he found that those bass really don't move deer as much. Now, don't get me wrong, you had the 1%ers that were nomads, and swam 500 miles. The majority of those fish stayed close where you released them. So when you look at all of our tournaments and all the bass being released, at the ramp, is that a good thing long term? I don't know. If you look at Paintsville, and I went electro fishing with them on the top end of the lake. We made a run through Upper Sand Lake. I don't know if you guys have been to Upper Sand Lake in Paintsville, but we caught 5 fish. It was like a 3-pounder, a 5-pounder. All those fish were at above relative weight, around 100%. On the lower end of the lake, where you have those tournament fish that are brought and dumped, the relative weight goes down, which would be understandable, right? You have more big predators, on that in the lake. So, I think that's an interesting conversation too. Is when we take these fish and we truck them all back to the ramp, is that a good thing for our lakes long term? I don't know.
Yeah, and Jared, back to your point about or having one tournament, like throwing everybody's name in the hat, like if there's 4 clubs fish all together, and I can see some benefits of that, but I can also see some negatives too, for the simple fact that if you have one tournament and one weighing entity, you have 100 boats and the water's hot, you now have to wait through 100 different boats weighing in, and a lot of people don't care. They'll have a black weigh-in bag sitting right on the blacktop cooking the water. Is it better to have 5 people weighing fish as opposed to one big giant entity? I don't know, but that would be a negative that I could see from that.
Yeah, I think it would. I think it would ultimately make overall less people join the tournament. Like it's going to make the people that are a little bit more skittish not, which, of course, that's not something that is good and, discouraging people from tournament fishing. But I know what you mean. It's a difficult thing. I mean, I kind of just wish that, overall there were less tournaments, but, coming from a guy that enjoys fishing tournaments, it's kind of a catch-22.
So, I mean, what's your guys' thoughts on the MLF style tournaments? Like, there was a club around Cincinnati that I think that was doing that, and the problem is that unless you have a person from the club that's like a marshal in every boat, which, let's face it, nobody wants to do that. I don't even think I would enjoy doing it with the pros. It just sucks sitting there watching them catching fish. I understand it's like you're getting a lesson there, but like the ability to have a club or have a lake that only did that, or even like got it to a point where, I've said it for a long time, and this is a hill that I'll die on. I think that more fish are killed during the spawn than forward-facing sonar all year, just for the simple fact is that, let's just take a large 4 to 6 pound female in the spring when she's, going to lay eggs or whatever. She's up there on the bed. JR, you go up there and you see her, you set the hook on her, you put her in the live well, and maybe you catch them at Rich Creek in Eastville and travel them like 12 miles down to the dam, and you turn them loose at the same spot. Now, are those fish going to spawn? I don't know. I'm not a biologist, but I feel like that they're going to have less of a chance to have a successful spawn because the water's deeper down there. The water temperature is going to be different from where you got it from, and I feel like that even having like a date almost like the Canadian side of St. Clair where you can't target fish at all. Like you can't even, like if you catch one, okay, it's catch and release only. I feel like that helps out too. I don't know how you do it,
but that's because of the gobies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, because like, I'm going to be honest with you, when I was a kid, we went to Lake Erie, and y'all think I'm crazy. We kept every smallmouth. I can show you pictures of, 18 smallmouth laid out from 3 of us, you know what I mean? And the fishing wasn't a lot different then, than it is now. If anything, my biggest fish came 25 years ago, when we were keeping all those fish. So I don't know. I think there's a lot there that we have to understand, as it relates to harvest, because we've always been trained, catch and release, catch and release. They'll all grow to 10 pounds, so that's going to be a tough narrative to break for all of us.
Right. And, like I said, I was truthful when I said that I've kept more bass this year than
Yes, sir.
any time in the last 20 years probably. And like, I will say that we've been fishing a few club tournaments with Marathon Bass League, which reminds me, guys, really quick. Brian Davison reached out to me earlier today. Let me make sure that I get this right. I'm pretty sure his casting for kids. Let's see, his partner backed out for the Chickamauga Classic. He needs a partner. So if you fished any of the 2025 events and would like to fish a Chickamauga Classic, reach out to Brian Davison or get a hold of us. We can get you in contact with that. But back to what I was saying about them, we fished Grayson the other day, and every fish that was under the slot limit, Brian took out of there in his live well and took them to a pond. There was like 57 bass we took out, which was pretty cool.
I think a concept that's kind of interesting to think about, you obviously are not going to be able to weigh the fish, take the weight. People are going to cheat. That's inevitable.
Right.
Something that kayak fishermen do is you go by length. So as bass fishermen in boats, do we say this is going to be a length tournament, and the person with the most length is the one that wins the tournament? I'd fish that. I don't care. I mean, sure, maybe you're going to have some really long skinny ones that wouldn't weigh as much, but to me, I think that's one thing that the kayak guys are doing right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if you put this up here or not, but this is
Oh,
Andy from Old Man by the Sea Productions. So he's a kayak fisherman. Matter of fact, he won one of the kayak tournaments up at your place there in Paintsville. There, I think it was not too long ago, a couple weeks ago. It was his first tournament. I think he entered and ended up winning it. So I'm sure he's got
awesome. Right on time.
Yeah. So I think that like I wouldn't mind fishing a length only tournament, and if you talk about cheating, Jason and those guys at Paintsville was recently hit by that. I mean, somebody found a freaking dog kennel or something attached to a freaking pole up there or whatever, and like,
that's
and
crazy.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I'm sure it happens everywhere, man. Like, it's just, I will tell you that I would much rather get my rear end whipped every tournament that I ever fished to even think about having to cheat to win one. Like,
man, every day I woke up, that's what I would think about. Like, you think them guys know? You think they know that I cheated? I mean, it would eat me from the inside. It wouldn't be any fun. I mean, I don't care how much money it was. You know what I mean? It would consume me.
Right, and those whatever 3 or 4 bass that were all dead in that thing, from what I can understand, like what I saw, like how long were those fish in there? Like, one,
do you think there's a chance that was from casting? You think somebody had a plan to make day 2? I mean, seriously, you think that was too long?
Man, I mean, so the money's right with casting for kids. I mean, you're talking what, $10,000? Like, I mean, that's big time money, and I think that I would like, not that it makes it any better, but I hope somebody, if they're going to cheat, they would do it to have, $10,000 is life changing to a lot of people, including to me. It'd pay off, most of my bills. But if they I surely hope that it wasn't somebody who's like, I'm gonna win $60 in this club tournament with these 4 fish.
Yeah, that's me. That's me. Agree.
Yeah, I mean, like, I just don't understand it. Like, now, if you go back to the guys in the walleye era that got caught putting the weights in the fish, and if you look at that whole story, dude, like, they literally ruined their entire fishing lives, if not their lives,
I was gonna say their lives.
On their tournament that they would have won anyway without the weight.
Sad part. That's the sad part.
Yeah, like I
don't know. Bounds above everyone else.
Like, they were head and shoulders above people, and like, they had a boat, they had a camera on their boat that the day before, and they whacked the walleye and then come back in the next day and try to beat everybody like 8 pounds. Like, well, something's not right here. You know what I mean? If you like, me as a bass fisherman, I can look at a picture, right? Okay, well that's about a 3-pounder, right? If somebody
Yep.
said this thing weighs, if I look at it and you throw it on the scale and this 3-pounder now weighs 7 pounds, I can tell you that that's not right. Either the scale's wrong or something's up with the fish. You know what I mean? Like these guys fished walleye all their life. That's all they did. And I think my biggest thing from that whole scandal is how would you like to be the guys that they beat out through those years of all those boats and stuff those guys won if you finished second to those guys?
How would you like to be those guys' kids? You know what I mean? Like you had to deal with that reputation. I don't know, man.
Dude,
You
I
guys
don't
are so
know.
silly. I hold myself to a higher level of accountability. I don't know. It's not worth it.
Yeah,
If
it's
I
not
if I
worth it.
win, I want to be able to ride home like, hey, you know what I mean? You guys are saying it's you want to do it the right way or don't do it at all. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, does does having a 10-pound ish fish swimming around in your lake, does that bring more cheaters?
So here's an interesting conversation. We're talking about how do you monitor these fish? You're going to put in 5,000 4 to 8 inch F1s for each of 5 years, so 25,000 4 to 8 inch fish. So do you go in, and this is the public educator in me, Tyler, you'll relate to this. If you go in, you tag those fish. Well, how many people do you run across that they catch that fish like, hey, that's tagged, that's an F1, it's going in the pond. You know what I mean? So there's two sides of that. Sure, there's the honest people like us be like, hey, 12 inches long, 925, 2026, whatever,
Yeah.
because that's what we like to do is gather data. But there's also going to be those people that take them home. So I think you have to look at marking some of them. We said, hey, if you're going to put 5,000 and mark 100 of them, tag 100 of them.
Yeah.
But if you tag them all, you're probably asking for trouble. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And so, if we have people right now, and I know there's people that cheat on Yatesville, Paintsville, like I've heard about people cheating my entire life, even on river tournaments where it takes 8 pounds to win regularly. Like there was a dude that like people were going to fist fight that showed up to the River Rat tournament when I was hosting it the one year, like 2019 there. The dude showed up and like it was going to be I almost had to call the cops. Like they were trying to fight this dude because like he had been a known cheater in the area and like they had like everybody knew it apparently but me. So
Yeah.
needless to say, he didn't fish, but like it happens everywhere. But I like to think that it doesn't matter how much you do to negate cheating. If somebody wants to cheat and is willing to do it, they're going to find a way to do so.
I agree with that.
I don't think that it's going to be like in that aspect in my mind. I like to think that that's like a very 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 outlier, right? That's like 1/1,000,000th of the percentage, right? But there's that one guy, one girl, one person that ruins it for everybody. But back to what you're talking about, like people taking the F1s out if they knew that they were tagged. They're one of the craziest stories that I have about tagged fish is that I was fishing the Robert C. Byrd locks and dams there in Gallipolis on the Ohio River. I was fishing, throwing a crankbait down the riprap wall on the West Virginia side, set the hook on a fish, ends up being about a 5-pound flathead. I pull in the boat and it has a tag in it. So it was like it was West Virginia DNR, and it said to remove the tag and call the number, and so I did all that. I put the tag in my pocket, called the DNR on Monday morning because it said there was like there was a reward, right? I was like, I'll see what this is about. So, I didn't expect it to be much, but I started looking online and there was like some of these tag fish that would give you like a weekend pass to stay at that like resort on Blennerhassett Island or whatever. And so I called them and they're like, oh yeah, give me the name, the number of the fish. And they're like, oh yeah, it was a, flathead, catfish. Like, yep. Like, where'd you catch it at? I said, I caught it below the Robert C. Byrd locks and dam on the Ohio River. And the lady was like, on the Ohio River. I was like, yeah. She's like, we turned that loose in a pond.
That's crazy.
So turns out my reward, by the way, was a 6-pack of offset shank worm hooks, EWGs. There was 6 supposed to be in the pack, and I only got 5 of them.
But there's not enough angler involved, data there. You know what I mean? How many times on Saturdays we talking about tournaments?
Thanks, Ben.
There's not enough angler involved, tournament data gathered. They say they do their creel, but you can go out. Let's just take casting for kids. What if you went out and you grabbed relative weight? And that's typically a fall measurement. But what if you grabbed it, on those fish for casting for kids every year, and you had that data to look at? You could look at the health of the fishery, and then if you look at the what was it, the Realtree article that came out early this year talking about Tennessee fisheries and how half the fish caught were F1s. So catchability is a whole other conversation here, in terms of what's the outcome with these F1s. If you're talking about a fish that's twice as catchable, because they said I think they caught 30% electrofishing were F1s, 60%, from the tournament results were F1s. That's huge, guys. That's huge piece of data.
I want them
That needs to be
spring break
investigated.
fish.
Yeah, and you're right. So I mean,
spring break fish.
it's kind of like rum spring, but it kind of, I mean, that's something I never really thought of is like, I think actually Jason put it in my mind on a post that I was, talking about, or maybe I saw it on his group, these fish that we're taking out of, let's just say for Grayson, right? Let's say those 57 fish that we took out that were under 12 inches the other day at that tournament. Well, what percentage of those fish are the catchable fish, right?
Great.
Are there triple that number that are not hungry or that are not in that situation or they're not eating what we're throwing? Like, are we taking out the bass that are easier to catch, or is there no correlation there? I mean, I know that would be super tough to figure out, but it seems like that there's something to that.
Definitely seems like some of them need to be electrofished out. And I heard that argument from a biologist. He's like, and again, I'm way out of my lane here. I'm a high school teacher, but catchability has been proven to be a heritable trait. So we know we can grow more catchable bass at this point in time. So it's definitely something that, and I guess that's what's fascinating about biology. JR, again, you forgot more about this than I would ever know, but that's one of the fascinating things. A lot of times, especially if you looked at over the last 60 years, it's almost like we threw mud at the wall, seeing if it would stick with some of these Florida genetics experiments. You know what I mean? And then lo and behold, some of them worked. Some of them grew state records and incredible bass. So, there's definitely, some investigation required here. I think going forward and again, back to what we were talking about earlier, I think what's the value of a 10-pound bass? If you had a lake and I look at Greenbow, you guys know Greenbow, I think it's 25% Florida genetics. You guys know if you ask somebody, where do you think the biggest bass caught in Eastern Kentucky would be? I think most of us probably say Greenbow. I think they had 3 or 4, 9-pound bass caught there last year. But, there's too many times where it's a coincidence that the elevated Florida genetics, follow those big fish. So, it definitely requires some investigation, I think, on just a common person, common logical, angler's viewpoint at this. It's definitely interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And going back to the Greenbow thing, obviously I still have the series going on because I've yet to do it, but it was called Catching a Coldwater Giant, and it was always a Greenbow just because I thought that was the opportunity to catch the biggest fish. But
Yes,
like
sir.
it was some of the most like engagement of any series I've had pretty much on my YouTube channel since the inception of it. And it was like not only local people, but I would have people commenting from like 2 or 3 states over and be like, "Oh, I used to fish there when I was a kid. There's
Yeah.
huge bass in there." But like Greenbow, from what I understand about that, is like it was kind of like a state regulated trophy bass lake that they just kind of like let it fall off, other than putting trout in there. Like they probably haven't done anything since the 70s, right? And it keeps
Right.
putting giant bass out. But what happens if you restock that place with F1s and keep
Yeah.
putting those trout in there? Do you catch a 15 to 18-pound bass out of there? I mean, I think if it right now it's sustaining 10-pound plus bass in there, and the only thing they're doing is putting trout in there, right? So what would happen if you were to supplement the genetics that are already there, right? So they will tell you that they put Florida strain bass in there at one point. And there used to be a time where you couldn't swim in there because they would fertilize it, and I think that's where all the grass is coming from still to this day. So they wanted it to be, for lack of a better term, like a small lake fork where they were trying to produce a giant bass, and like it has worked in the past, and they've not touched it for years, and it's still producing. So like, I think that's another thing we have to look at too as anglers is like if this F1 stuff works locally, like Paintsville and stuff like that, like we can't like sit on our laurels and just say let's leave well enough alone.
I'll tell you something that's interesting there, Tyler. Last summer they had the Black Bass Summit at the Fish and Wildlife headquarters in Kentucky. They invited us to come down, and I thought it was interesting. The conversation then, if you're going to do F1s and Florida strain stockings in more than, a few lakes in Kentucky, you're going to have another hatchery. Kentucky only has 2 hatcheries. Last summer they presented that to us like it was just this unbelievable mountain. It was hundreds of millions of dollars, wasn't possible. And then, this year, 12 months later, our commissioners are talking about, hey, we're looking at a hatchery and some land. So I think that's one obstacle, if you're going to continue with these stockings. If you look at Tennessee, Tennessee's had some success. They've expanded hatcheries. They've invested millions there. But that's because they know what the return on the investment is, and we all know that, but we're going to have another hatchery, whether it be Western Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, maybe 2 more hatcheries to sustain, F1 stockings going forward if they are successful.
Right, and I think that will, it's kind of like if we go back. I keep harping on Lake Fork just for the simple fact that it's fresh in my mind. I was there in April. Like the Texas ShareLunker program. For those of you guys that don't know, anything above 8 pounds is considered to be a ShareLunker, and then you get up into like Legacy's class. There's like 13-pound plus bass or whatever, and I think it's anything over 10 pounds that they will come to wherever you're at in Texas within a certain amount of mileage. You bring the fish to them or to a dock. They meet you with a truck that's aerated. They take that bass back to a hatchery, and they spawn that bass artificially, and then they take those fry and they take that bass that you caught that's still alive, hopefully, gets put back in the same lake where you caught it at, along with those fry. So like they're wholesale, going into that because, as you said, they see the benefit of it, and it's let's face it, anything that comes down to, politics, and I hate to say this, it boils down to money. How can this affect money? And I think we've already hit on that. It's the gas, it's the restaurants, it's the, as bad as it sounds, this is the speeding tickets, it's the whatever, it's stuff that like my buddy Dusty was down in Lake Norman Lake Murray this weekend. Took off in what he thought wasn't a no wake zone and got pulled over by Mr. No Fun, got like a $109 ticket, right? I mean, he wasn't trying to do anything like that, but that $109 went into the economy there. So I think the money aspect comes around, and I think that's going to be one of those things that they will see. They have to see the forest for the trees. You know what I mean?
And did you see the stat from our Chamber of Commerce? They said 67 cents of every dollar spent stays local. So I think when you're talking about, thousands, 67 cents, guys, 67%, however you want to look at it, that's a lot of money from every dollar that's spent that stays local. When you're talking about chasing largemouth bass, I'm just saying, because you guys know if you go stay, it's $150 a night, let's call it, like you said, $150 in the boat. If there's a tackle shop, you guys know we're all stopping, hey, what are they catching them on? We're going to spend $50, $100, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go to Paintsville Lake, could you say it's an $800 weekend? I think so,
Yeah, no, it's easy that, I mean, JR can speak to that just from this past weekend. He went to Lake St. Clair to fish a tournament, and I'm sure he had $800+ in it with fuel and all that other stuff. And it's not, and I think what you don't see is, for me as a fisherman, I don't look at like foregone expenses, right? So like, let's just say that I drive my truck to Texas, right? I do that. It was like 3,500 miles that I drove in 11 days. It's like 36 hours in a truck, sleeping in the back of it. But I put 3,500 miles on my truck. Now, if that's 3,500 miles on a truck that I drive every day, which now becomes quicker that I have to buy a new truck. Now that money is a lot more expensive, and I'm going to be spending money here. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of stuff that you don't look at with expenses, like, you know, looking like Chris Malone or somebody like Ferguson's Great Outdoors. Like, these people thrive off of, you know, boat sales, and that happens with, you know, people that come here to catch an F1 10-pounder at Paintsville. They drive by Malone's Marine on the way here to pick up some oil or something. You know what I mean? There's a lot more stuff that people that I didn't think about until, you know, going down to Lake Fork. Like, I was just random stuff, like stopping at grocery stores to grab myself something to eat for the night. Airbnbs, there's just so much that can get pumped into the area, and I'm just thankful that, you know, folks like you and especially the people in Kentucky. I wish Ohio would kind of take a page from your guys' book, and I'm hoping that I can make a little bit of difference. I do have Darren Abbott, our game warden, I'm kind of twisting his ear a little bit about Vesuvius, trying to get them to put F1s in there. If eventually, you know, we can show data from Paintsville and Yatesville eventually that these things do work, and, you know, they can live there, and look at the impact that it has.
You know, and I think the IGFA kind of complicated all this for everybody. You know, if for us, if we can't visually look at a fish that we land and be like, all right, this is a smallmouth or this is a largemouth, you know, or even a spotted bass, you know, to me, like, breaking it up, you know, I understand it, you know, creates more opportunities for records. But, you know, when you look at, all right, this is a Florida fish, this is a hybrid, and this is a northern, which is something they haven't separated yet, you know, as far as the IGFA records go. But, you know, that's an interesting conversation. And I think, if anything, when you talk about genetics in our states, you know, it shows you how little we truly know. You know, there's a lot more that we don't understand than we do understand. And to be saying that we know, you know, concrete outcomes, we don't. You know what I mean? There are too many anomalies when you look at, you know, High Splint, Fish Pond, Greenbow, and all those examples we've talked about. You know, there's just so much room for investigation. And, you know, what could we grow here? You know, if we could grow, what about a 12-pound bass? What's a 12-pound bass, or a lake that could possibly grow a 12-pound bass? What's that worth, you know, to a rural economy? You know, you guys know you'd have to park in the grass.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like Greenbow in the springtime. Like, you can go there, and it's literally no bigger than a minute. You can, you know, idle around that thing in 20 minutes. But there's sometimes 50 boats in that lake. Like, it's pretty much you're walking over somebody's boat to get to the next one to fish the next spot, which is crazy. But, you know, and that's, you know, I think since, you know, it's needs to be noted that since COVID, I believe that there's more people on the water. Not only pleasure boaters, but fishermen too. So that has to be taken into consideration with the conservation that DNR is doing across the United States, because there's more people on the water, which means that, let's just say that delayed morbidity thing is really true. Even if they don't take fish out of there, there's more fish being killed, which means that, you know, at the rate that they're being caught, they're being killed doubly as quick than they normally have. Because let's say there's double people on the lake. Now,
Yes,
the amount of, you know, stocking that they're doing 20 years ago may have been, you know, sufficient to withstand the population of that lake. But now, when you have what seems like, especially in the last 15 years, there's been a boom of fishing, and I think that's due to MLF, and it's due to BASS, and it's due to the Bassmaster Classic and Red Crest, and college fishermen and bass, you know, are fishing at the high school level. Like, it's exploded in the last 15 to 18 years, and I think that you're seeing more people on the water, which means more people are catching fish, which is obviously inherently, you know, inevitable. But more fish are dying. Now, there's still the same amount of fish there, and they're still doing the same amount of reproduction as they normally have, with twice the amount of pressure. So we have to do something, and I think that this F1 is definitely going to be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I can't wait. You know, and I think, how do you define success there? You know, if you look at this 5-10 years down the road, do we have more quality fish? Does that define success? Does, you know, that 10-12 pound bass, you know, does that define success? You know, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to follow. You know, I think the thing is, we're going to have to be patient here. We're talking about, 5 to 8 to 10 years down the road, but before we're going to see, results. But like you said, with the habitat, and the Threadfin, I think we're in a really good spot. And I think for other people, and I've heard from other, commissioners and different people in politics across the state that now every county judge, wants F1s in their lake, and that's going to be expected. But, I think you're going to have to, number one, we need to support this experiment and see that it goes. But, number two, put your lake in a good spot. If you're an overpopulated lake, like let's say Grayson, they say you're wasting money to throw F1s in there because there are so many small bass that you're not going to see the rewards that, we would if it was a properly balanced population. So, and then I think you have to investigate, Threadfin. We've talked a lot about Cave Run. And I think if you look at bigger lakes, at least on our side of the state, Cave Run has the most potential there as any, if it had Threadfin. And there's a lot of good movement down there from several. I've spoken to 4 or 5 people recently that are all in on, trying to get Threadfin funded in Cave Run. So, I think you start with Threadfin. Cave Run's got a great, habitat program already ongoing. So, I think Cave Run and Yatesville, if I was going to pick 1 or 2 lakes to go forward, those would be my 2.
For sure. Well, Jason, we're about that 1 hour mark, man. I appreciate it. You coming and talking F1s with us. And I think the, going forward, anybody that sees this at this point, this now needs to become your mentality as an angler. It's not just us. We're 3 people. And there's. But if you look at Jason and his group, again, if you guys are not a member of his group on Facebook, Anglers for Improving Opportunities, definitely go out there and search that up. There's all kinds of information on there. But it goes to prove that it doesn't take a million people to get things done. It takes a group of people that have a passion, that have legit information that can be proven, right? If you said, if you can catch a 15-pound bass out of here, I can prove that we're going to have $10 million in our economy. You're not going to do that. Nobody's going to be able to do that. It would be over the scope of this. But, if you go out and say, okay, X amount of people fish this lake now, let's just say that we, jump that by even 2%, right? That's 2% more people spending money in our area. And I think that, with a united front as not only anglers out there catching fish, but the biggest thing that, that kind of gets glossed over is that make sure you're doing the conservation thing. Like, take bass out. Like, if you don't, we're going to end up in the situation like Grayson is right now, where there's 100 million bass in that place, but they're all 8 inches long. But, something that just hit me a minute ago when you were talking about that, do F1s survive in a place like Grayson where, there's a million bass in there? But at some point, if those F1s now, if they grow twice as fast, roughly on average, than a northern stream bass, there's a quick turnaround where those predators now become prey.
I agree with that. All over your mind's at. I agree. Totally
So,
agree.
I mean, like, so maybe it's like the DNR in Ohio, bud. They'll turn like coyotes loose, and they'll turn like timber rattlers and stuff loose. Why? I mean, which have zero effect other than negative. But they're like, yeah, it's like they turn those turkey bugs loose, those little ladybug looking things. They're like, oh, they're for the turkey, dude. Turkey won't even eat them. They're everywhere. That's crazy.
Same. They're in my
But
house.
anyway, guys. Yeah. So anyway, guys, if you guys are just now joining us or whatever, go over on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, check out Jason's group. There's a ton of information. Even if you're not, it's based around Paintsville and the area, Yatesville, and places like that. But it's not just for Kentucky anglers. It's information that everybody can get involved with. There's a lot of stuff on there from biologists. There's a lot of stuff on there that I learn something new on there practically every day, which I'm thankful for. But it's Anglers for Improving Opportunities on Facebook. Just search it up. If you can't find it, let me know. I'll get you access to it. But we do have, thanks to folks like Jason and a few other people, not just a few other people, but lots of other people that have spearheaded this event to try to. Yeah, Chris Fergus has been part of it too. To get F1s in Kentucky, and like there was a bill that was just passed. Like, it is happening. It's not like, oh, maybe. No, like at some point, as Jason and I were talking before the show started, there's a lot of red tape and a lot of forms and stuff that people have to fill out in the political world, obviously, because they're using public funds for all that stuff. And the deal is to put, what is it, was it 5,000 or what's the first
Yep.
stocking there?
5,000 4 to 8-inch F1s every year for 5 years.
Dude, I think that's going to be big. Like if you
I do too.
now again, going back to what I just said, if you get a lake that's like predominantly F1s, you're probably going to have to turn loose bigger fish than that because those are now minnows to those jokers.
Agreed.
4 to 8 inch fish are like good glide bait for those guys.
That's right.
But anyway, it's been a great thing. Let's see. This is something that the Paintsville
We did
Thrift
not
and
have thrift. They stocked them in the 90s, and that took place in several lakes in Kentucky. The KDFWR ran a 3-year experiment. I think Cave Run, Paintsville, those are 2 of the lakes, but they could not sustain them over time. Obviously, no matter which side of the climate argument you're on, climate's a little different now than it was, I think, 30 years ago. So that's what we argued, and that's how we got them to proceed with thrift and stockings.
Yeah, so and I think it's made a huge difference. I mean, there was 8-pounder caught out there in a tournament
Yes, sir.
this past year. So like that, I don't think that was like few and far between, if ever, at Paintsville.
Yes, sir.
There's just, I mean, it's making a difference. So I want to commend you on your efforts, and Chris Ferguson,
Appreciate it.
everybody else involved, and everybody down there that's been in the ears of all the politicians, and thankful to have politicians that are listening to their constituents, if you will, because let's face it, I mean, they're supposed to work for us, right? Not the other way around. And I think
That's
that
right.
you got a good group down there, and I think it's awesome. So again, Jason, I appreciate you sticking around with us for this hour and 10 minutes or so. JR had to hop off there. His kids was getting tired and he had to put them to bed. So it is, family comes first, but I'm looking forward to it, and I'm gonna get a hold of you here in a day or so. I'm gonna make a trip down to Paintsville, and if you're off, maybe we can hook up and go down there, and you can show me some stuff, because I've never been to Paintsville. I went to Paintsville one time on my pleasure boat, and I ended up catching a bass because I threw a rooster tail on a tree and I caught a bass. I've caught a bass at Paintsville, but I've never been there in the last. It's been 15 years ago, probably 18 years ago. So I'll get a hold of you. Maybe we can link up and we can go catch the fish down there. But I appreciate you joining us for this episode of On Another Line. I learned a ton, and I'm sure everybody else did too.
Awesome. Thanks for having us. Appreciate you, Tyler.
Yeah, well, I'll see you, man. Guys, you guys know what to do. You can get out there and lean on them. We'll see you next time on Another Line.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of On Another Line Live. We truly appreciate your support, and we couldn't do it without all the amazing folks at home watching week after week. A big thank you goes out to our sponsors, who help make this show possible. Malone's Marine, Borders Sporting Goods, Solar Bat Sunglasses, Picasso Lures, Shimano, and Columbia Sportswear. Their partnership allows us to keep bringing you the content you love. We'll see you next time on Another Line. Until then, get out there and lean on them.